They condemned his swampy low field. He drained it for $22 and fed his family for 18 years. The county extension agent arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1963. His name was Douglas Pratt. He was 39, had held the Dunklin County position for 7 years, and he walked the low field on Vernon Stokes's property twice before he said anything at all. 2 passes. 40 minutes total. He came back to where Vernon was standing by the fence post and pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket. The field was 3.2 acres of bottomland, sitting in the southwest corner of Vernon's property in Dunklin County, Missouri, just east of County Road 546. It sat roughly 8 inches lower than the surrounding land. In wet years, it held standing water from February through May, some years into June. The soil underneath was heavy gray clay with a bluish tint that meant poor drainage and low oxygen content, the kind of subsoil that turned roots black before a plant had a chance to establish itself. Pratt wrote 3 lines in his notebook, closed it, told Vernon the field was unsuitable for row crops or garden production in its current condition, said the water table sat too close to the surface, said correcting it would require a contractor with tile-laying equipment, proper drainage engineering, and an outfall structure. Said the cost estimate for a field that size was somewhere between $800 and $1,200, depending on soil composition and existing drainage infrastructure. He left his card on the fence post, shook hands, drove back out onto County Road 546. Vernon was 54 years old, had farmed in Dunklin County his entire life. Born 3 miles from where he was standing, his father had worked this same property before him, and his grandfather had broken the original ground on it in 1902. He listened to everything Douglas Pratt said, watched the county car pull away. Then he walked the low field a 3rd time by himself. The soil was damp through the soles of his boots. Not standing water, it was late September, the driest stretch of the year in the Missouri Boothiel, the weeks when the water table finally pulled back from the surface and the field looked almost workable. He stood in the center of it and looked west toward the road. The field sloped that direction. Not much. Barely a visible grade. But it sloped. He'd known that for 30 years. Water moved west when it moved at all. Problem was it didn't move fast enough. It pooled in the clay, soaked in slow. Stayed for months. The Stokes family had 7 people in the house that fall. Vernon, his wife Clara, and their 5 children ranging from 9 to 19 years old. Grocery costs for a family that size in Dunklin County in 1963 ran about $18 a week. Vernon earned $12 a week doing machine repair 3 days at Vickers Equipment in Kennett, Missouri. Clara took in ironing 2 days a week for extra income. Together they kept up, not with anything to spare. But they kept up. The low field was 3.2 acres, producing nothing, had produced nothing for as long as Vernon could remember working the property. His father had tried to row crop it twice, once in 1928 and again in 1934. Both times, a wet spring had flooded it out before the plants were knee-high. His father had eventually called it drainage land and left it. Used it occasionally for late summer grazing when it was dry enough to hold cattle weight, mostly left it. Vernon had tried it himself in 1958, put in a half-acre of late corn along the north edge where it was highest. Lost the whole stand to standing water in May. He didn't try again. Until 1963. Pratt's estimate sat in his head through the rest of September. He didn't have $800. Didn't have half of that. The fall repair season at Vickers was steady, but not that kind of money. He started asking questions instead. The first question went to Earl Pittman, who farmed 180 acres about 2 miles east on Route 412. Earl was 71 and had worked that land since 1921. He knew Dunklin County's soil the way you only learned it by watching it for 50 years. Vernon described the low field, explained the grade, asked what he thought it would take to drain it without a contractor. Earl listened, didn't answer right away, scratched the back of his neck, asked if the field sloped toward the road. Vernon said it did. Earl said there had been a place 2 miles further east, the old Peterson property, that had been sold off in pieces the previous year. Farmstead was gone. Said the Peterson field had run on a clay tile drain system since the early 1920s, and that system had worked without interruption for 40 years. Said nobody had hauled the tile away after the demolition. Said it might be worth a call to whoever was handling the estate. Vernon called the estate lawyer in Kennett on a Thursday. The tile was still there. 643 sections of 4-inch clay drainage tile, half in the original bundles, the rest loose in a pile behind the old barn foundation. The lawyer wanted them cleared, asked if Vernon could haul them himself. Vernon asked what he wanted for the lot. The lawyer said $22. $22 for 643 sections of 4-inch clay drainage tile, for a field that Douglas Pratt had told him could not be corrected for less than $800. Vernon drove to the Peterson place that Saturday in his 1958 Ford F-100. He loaded the truck bed as full as it would take. Made 4 trips that day, the last one finishing after dark with the headlights lighting up the remaining pile. By Sunday evening, 486 sections of tile were stacked along the fence line at the southwest corner of his property, organized by condition. The remaining 157 sections he left at the Peterson site. Too cracked or split to be reliable. He had the tile. He did not have a tile plow or a trenching machine. What he had was a 2-round point spade he'd used since 1948, a mattock with a cracked handle he'd wrapped twice in baling wire, and time before the ground froze. He started digging on October 6, 1963. The plan was straightforward. Lay a main drainage line from the center of the field west to the road ditch along County Road 546. Run lateral branches off the main line every 30 feet, extending north and south across the field. The tile would collect subsurface water through its open joints and carry it downgrade by gravity to the outfall ditch. No pump, no electrical equipment, no ongoing cost, just slope and physics doing what slope and physics did. The clay soil was firm in the upper 6 inches and gummy below that. It smelled of iron and decomposed root matter, a heavy, low smell that rose whenever the spade went in deep. He cut the trench 12 inches deep and about 6 inches wide, enough to nestle each 12-inch tile section in a slight V-cut that kept it from shifting laterally. He worked from the road ditch inward, starting at the outfall end so water would have somewhere to go the moment he started laying tile. The main line ran 210 feet from the center of the field to the road. He dug it in 7 days, working 2 to 3 hours each morning before his vicar's shifts, longer on his days off. Clara brought coffee to the fence line on the cold mornings. The October air in the Boothiel that year had a sharp edge to it before noon, the kind of cold that settled in around the ears and the backs of the hands. He laid the tile end to end with a 1/4-inch gap between sections, enough for water to seep in through the joint, not enough for soil to migrate inside and clog the line. He wrapped each joint with a strip of burlap cut from old Purina feed sacks, tucked it over the gap like a bandage, then backfilled over it in layers. The burlap kept soil from infiltrating while still letting water pass. The first 3 lateral branches went in on October 15th. Each one ran 90 feet north from the main line at 30-foot intervals. 4 more days of digging. He added 3 southern laterals by October 22nd, running the same distance in the opposite direction. The complete system used 411 of his 486 sections. He stacked 75 sections against the fence post for future repairs. Backfilling was careful work. He shoveled the clay back in 4-inch layers, tamping each one with his boot heel before adding the next. Where the main line ran nearest to the road, he reinforced the outfall with Flat Creek rock hauled from behind the machine shed, heavy gray limestone that wouldn't shift in high water. By October 28th, the field looked like a field again. Slightly mounded lines where the trenches had settled. Grass already starting to recover at the edges. 22 days of work from first spade to final tamping. No machinery. No contractor. Total cost, $22 for the tile, and whatever the burlap had been worth before he'd cut it up. He didn't mention it at Vickers. Didn't mention it at the feed store. He told Clara what he'd done, and she walked the field with him one evening in early November, the two of them moving along the main line in the last light. She asked how he'd known it would work. He said he hadn't. Said he'd known it was worth $22 to find out. The first real test came in February of 1964. The winter had been wet even by Dunklin County standards. January dropped 1 inches of rain. February came in colder and wetter, snow on the 8th, then a slow warm-up that melted everything into the soil over 2 weeks. In past years, that combination had left the low field sitting under 2 to 4 inches of water from late February clear through April, sometimes longer. Vernon walked the field on February 21st, 1964. The soil was saturated. Heavy underfoot. His boots sank slightly with each step, the clay compressing. But there was no standing water, none in the center where it had always been worst, none along the edges where it came in from the north. He pressed his boot heel into the ground at the field's lowest point and lifted it. Left a print about 1 inch deep. The previous February, that same spot had been underwater. By March 10th, the field was workable along the main drainage line, still wet further from the tile runs, still too soft to put a tractor on without compacting. But workable on foot, workable for hand tools, workable for planting within the next 4 to 6 weeks. It wasn't perfect. He'd expected that. The lateral spacing was every 30 feet, which meant the midpoints between tile runs still drained slower than the zones directly above the tile. But the improvement was not marginal. It was not the kind of change you had to squint to see. It was obvious. He mentioned it to Earl Pittman in late March at the Dunklin County Feed and Supply on 3rd Street in Kennett. Said the old Peterson tile seemed to be holding up, said the field had come through the February wet without flooding. Earl nodded, said he wasn't surprised. Said clay tile laid right outlasted the men who laid it. Douglas Pratt was at the feed store counter that same afternoon. He didn't ask about the field. Vernon didn't bring it up. Planting went in on April 14th, 1964. Sweet potatoes along the main drainage line first, where the soil had dried soonest. Turnips and late cabbage along the southern lateral zone. A 1/4 acre of sweet corn in the northwest section, which had the densest tile coverage and the most consistent drainage. Sweet potatoes were well suited to drained bottomland. The clay subsoil held nutrients and retained enough moisture through dry stretches that plants didn't need irrigation. But with the tile system in place, roots didn't sit in standing water long enough to rot. The drainage hadn't changed what the soil was. It had just changed what the soil could do. The 1964 harvest was not a record. Vernon hadn't expected a record. He expected the field to produce, and it did. He pulled 380 pounds of sweet potatoes from the central zone in October, 90 pounds of turnips from the southern laterals. A reasonable run of sweet corn that the family put up and ate through the fall. Clara canned 24-quart jars of sweet potato the first week of November. Vernon sold 80 pounds to a neighbor, Thomas Buford, at 11 cents per pound. $8.80 from a field that had been producing nothing the previous October. Buford asked what he'd done differently. Vernon explained it. The tile, the grade, the outfall. Buford listened, said he had a wet corner in his North 40 he'd been meaning to look at. Word moved the way it moved in Dunklin County. Fence line to fence line. Feed store to feed store. Not fast by outside standards, but reliably. By the spring of 1965, 3 different men had walked Vernon to the low field's edge on one excuse or another. Borrowed tools returned. A question about the fence line. A look at some equipment near the shed. They stood at the edge and looked at the field, the way you look at something you're trying to understand without asking too directly. 2 of them eventually asked. Vernon told them what he'd done. He kept it plain. Showed one of them where the main tile line ran by pointing to the slight ridge in the soil that marked where the trench had settled. Walked him to the outfall at the road ditch, where even then, 3 weeks past the last significant rain, a thin trickle of clear water was still moving into the drainage ditch. James Wheaton, who farmed 220 acres on the north side of the county, stood at that outfall for a full minute without saying anything. Drove home. 5 months later, he bought second-hand clay tile from an estate sale east of Haiti and laid it himself in a wet corner that had been useless since his father's time. Vernon added 3 more lateral branches to his own system through 1965 and 1966. The eastern portion of the field had been the most stubborn. That was where the field's slight depression was deepest, where water sat longest in wet years. He used the 75 spare sections he'd kept, plus 40 more he bought from a second estate source for $6 even. The eastern zone came into production by early April of 1966. Previously, it hadn't been workable before late May in wet years. Barely at all in heavy ones. By 1967, all 3.2 acres were in rotation. Vernon kept the crop plan in a brown craft paper notebook he stored on the machine shed shelf next to a tin of graphite grease. Sweet potato in the central zone every other year. Beans and turnips cycling through the lateral zones on a 3-year rotation. Watermelon in the eastern section during dry summers, when the loosened clay mix there produced fruit consistently in the 18 to 24-pound range. Late corn on the higher northern edge in any year when spring came in dry enough. Clara put up between 80 and 120 quart jars of garden produce each summer and fall from that field alone. The mason jar shelf in the back hallway held October's work in careful rows: sweet potato, green beans, corn relish, the occasional batch of watermelon rind pickles that ran sweet and sharp and lasted well into the following spring. There were weeks in late summer when Clara bought nothing at the Piggly Wiggly on 4th Street in Kennett, except flour, coffee, and salt. The tile system required maintenance every few years. Not much, but some. When a section shifted or collapsed, the field would show it after a heavy rain. A soft spot would appear along a line that had always drained clean. Vernon learned to walk the field after each significant rain and read it. He'd learned to do that from Earl Pittman, who'd walked his own fields the same way for 50 years. Earl Pittman died in January of 1971. He was 79. Vernon attended the service at First Baptist Church in Kennett. Stood outside afterward in the cold talking to Earl's son Robert, who had taken over the farm. Said that conversation in October of 1963 had been worth more than anything the Extension Service had given him in 20 years of asking. Robert Pittman just nodded. Said his father had spent a lifetime reading Wet Ground and knew what water could and couldn't do when you worked with it instead of against it. Douglas Pratt left the extension position in 1969. His replacement, a man named Carl Bowen, who'd come from a Springfield office, visited Vernon's property in the spring of 1971 as part of a county farm assessment. He walked the low field, took notes, asked when the drainage system had been installed and which contractor had done the work. Vernon told him there was no contractor, explained the tile purchase, the hand-dug trenches, the gravity outfall to the road ditch. Bowen wrote something in his clipboard folder, said it was an unusually effective system for a self-installed drain, asked if Vernon would allow it to be documented for county extension records. Vernon said he didn't mind. A young man from Bowen's office came out in August of 1971 with a measuring rod and a survey board. He spent the better part of 2 hours in the field, mapping the tile run locations by drainage surface signs and tracing the outfall. His summary, filed at the county extension office in Kennett that fall, noted the system covered 3.1 of the field's 3.2 acres, employed approximately 411 sections of 4-inch clay drainage tile, and brought the soil to workable moisture level within 72 hours of significant rainfall events. The summary went into a manila folder in a filing cabinet. It was never published or circulated, but it was there. The field's best single year was 1974. Vernon had expanded the watermelon block to 3/4 of an acre in the eastern section, where the drainage was strongest, and the clay mix near the surface had been worked loose enough over 10 years to grow consistent fruit. The melons ran large that season, most in the 20 to 24-pound range, some heavier. He set up a card table and a handwritten sign at the corner of County Road 546 and Route 412, 2 Saturdays in late July and 1 in early August. Sold 230 watermelons before noon each day. Total from the 1974 watermelon crop, $184. From a field that Douglas Pratt had put at zero value 11 years before. By the late 1970s, the field had become unremarkable. It was just the southwest field, the one with the tile drain, the one that grew the sweet potatoes and watermelons and beans. Vernon didn't discuss it particularly. The neighbors who'd asked questions in 1965 had long since drawn their own conclusions about whether it had worked. A few of them had tried similar things on their own wet ground. A few hadn't. Either way, the low field at the Stokes place had stopped being a subject and had become simply a feature. The children grew up and left through the 1970s. The youngest, a boy named Dale, moved to Memphis in 1976. Vernon was 67 that year. Clara had eased off the heavy canning work. Her hands had started to trouble her in the fall cold, and 40 or 50 jars a season was what she could manage comfortably rather than 80 or 100. But the field kept producing. Vernon worked it slower. He took longer to do the same tasks, added rest stops he hadn't needed in 1964. But he worked it. He reduced the planted area in 1980, not because the field had failed, because 3.2 acres was more than he could cover alone at 71. He concentrated on the central and southern zones, closest to the main drainage line, where yields were most reliable and the walking distance from the house was least. A half acre of sweet potatoes, a 1/4 acre of beans, a strip of turnips along the eastern edge. Still producing. Still drawing off the same tile he'd laid in October of 1963. Some of those tiles had been in the Peterson field since the early 1920s. By 1980, the oldest sections had been underground for roughly 60 years, still carrying water west. Vernon sold the Dunklin County property in the spring of 1981. He was 72. Clara's older sister had a house in Poplar Bluff, and they moved in with her that March. The property went to a younger family, the Harpers, who were expanding a commercial operation north from the central Bootheel. He walked the farm with the Harpers before the closing, showed them the drainage system, explained where the main line ran, How to find a section failure after heavy rain by watching for soft spots along a drainage line that normally ran firm. Said the tile was old. Some of it had been underground since the Peterson place in the 1920s, and that sections failed occasionally, but the system was otherwise sound. Said to keep burlap over the joints when doing any repairs. Said any feed sack would do. Told them the total he'd spent was $22 for the tile and $6 for the second batch in 1966. $28. 3 weeks of digging in October of 1963. The younger of the two Harpers, a man about 30, stood for a moment looking at the field. Said nothing. Just looked. Vernon showed them where the outfall ran under the road edge into the county ditch. Showed them the 31 spare tile sections still stacked at the fence post. Said to keep them there. Said they'd need one eventually. He farmed that field for 18 years. Fed 7 people for the first decade of it, 2 for the years at the end. The field produced through the wet spring of 1967, through the dry summer of 1976, which had burned down the corn on his higher ground, while the sweet potatoes in the drained bottomland came through largely intact. The clay subsoil holding moisture in drought the same way the tile released it in flood, and through every ordinary year in between. That was the part that hadn't been in Douglas Pratt's calculation. The tile drainage hadn't just removed the problem. It had made the field more stable in both directions. Wet years drained faster. Dry years held longer. The system didn't just control water. It managed it. Vernon Stokes died in 1988. He was 79. By then, the field had been in continuous production for 24 years, 6 more years beyond his ownership. 4 crops of Harper's sweet corn, 3 years of soybean rotation, and whatever else they'd put in that he hadn't known about. The Harper family held the property until 1996. By then, some of the original tile had been underground for 70 years. The drainage system was still functional at the time of sale. The Harpers told the new buyers about it. Showed them where the main line ran. Showed them the outfall. The card table and the handwritten watermelon sign were long gone. The Ford F-100 was long gone. The No-2 spade was long gone. The tile was still there, still carrying water west, still doing what $22 and 3 weeks of October digging had set it to do, still working.